The bullet that shattered Dominic O'Brien's leg came from a rustler's Winchester on a moonless night in September of 1878, and though the surgeon in San Bernardino saved his life, the man couldn't save him from the limp that would follow him like a shadow for the rest of his days. 6 months later, in the spring of 1879, Dominic rode into Mojave, California with nothing but a bedroll, a horse that had seen better years, and a leg that dragged behind him with every step he took on solid ground. Mojave wasn't much to look at, just a collection of weathered buildings squatting in the desert heat where the railroad was planning to push through. The town consisted of a general store, a saloon that doubled as a boarding house, a livery stable, and a handful of other structures that seemed to be holding their breath against the relentless wind that blew across the Mojave Desert. Dominic had come here because he'd heard the railroad needed men, and he figured even a crippled cowboy could swing a hammer or haul supplies if the pay was decent enough. He dismounted in front of the livery, and the moment his boots hit the ground, his right leg buckled slightly. He caught himself against his horse's flank, steadying his balance before he straightened up and grabbed his bedroll. The liveryman, a grizzled fellow with more beard than face, watched him with narrowed eyes. "That'll be 2 bits a day for the horse," the man said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "You looking for work?" "I am," Dominic replied, his voice roughened by days of desert travel. "Heard the railroad's hiring." The liveryman's gaze dropped to Dominic's leg, then back up to his face. "They're hiring able-bodied men. No offense, stranger, but I don't think they're looking for someone who can't walk straight." Dominic felt the familiar burn of shame in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. "I can work as hard as any man. The leg doesn't stop me from doing what needs doing." The liveryman shrugged. "Suit yourself. Camp's about a mile east of town. Ask for Jack Morrison. He's the foreman." Dominic paid for 3 days of boarding for his horse and headed toward the saloon, his limp more pronounced after hours in the saddle. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of whiskey. A handful of men sat at tables, playing cards or nursing drinks. Behind the bar stood a woman who looked to be in her late 50s, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. "You got rooms?" Dominic asked. $2 a week, meals included if you're here for breakfast and supper," the woman said. "Name's Margaret. You pay up front." Dominic counted out the money and took the key she offered. His room was small and sparse, but the bed looked clean, and that was all he needed. He set his bedroll down and sat on the edge of the mattress, rubbing his aching leg. The old wound throbbed in the heat, a constant reminder of the night that had changed everything. Before the injury, Dominic had been one of the best ranch hands in Southern California. He could rope a steer faster than most men could blink, could break a wild horse with patience and skill, and could ride from sunup to sundown without complaint. Now, he was lucky if he could walk across a room without someone staring at his uneven gait. The other cowboys on his last ranch had started calling him Gimpy and Hopalong, and though Dominic had tried to ignore the mockery, it had worn him down like water on stone. He'd left that ranch, with his pride in tatters, determined to find a place where his past didn't matter, and his limp didn't define him. The next morning, Dominic woke before dawn and made his way to the railroad camp. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky with streaks of orange and pink as he walked the dusty road out of town. His leg protested with each step, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. When he reached the camp, he found dozens of tents and a crew of men already stirring, preparing for the day's work. Jack Morrison was a bull of a man with shoulders like an ox and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He stood near a supply wagon, barking orders at the men around him. Dominic approached and waited for a break in the conversation. "You Morrison?" he asked. The foreman turned, looking Dominic up and down. "That's right. Who's asking?" "Name's Dominic O'Brien. I'm looking for work." Morrison's eyes flickered to Dominic's leg and his expression hardened. "We need men who can haul rails and drive spikes. You think you can do that?" "I know I can," Dominic said, meeting the man's gaze without flinching. Morrison seemed to consider this for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't think so. We can't afford to have someone slowing down the crew. Sorry, friend, but we need workers who can keep pace." "Give me a day to prove myself," Dominic said. "If I can't keep up, I'll leave without argument." Morrison's jaw worked as he thought it over. Finally, he nodded. "One day. But you don't get paid unless I decide to keep you on. Fair?" "Fair enough." The work was brutal. Dominic spent the morning hauling supplies from the wagon to the worksite, his legs screaming with every trip. The other men watched him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. By midday, when the crew broke for lunch, Dominic was drenched in sweat and his leg felt like it was on fire. He sat apart from the others, eating the bread and salted meat he'd brought from town. "Look at that poor bastard," one of the workers said, his voice carrying across the camp. "Can barely walk, and he thinks he can work the rails." "Morrison must be desperate," another man replied with a laugh. "Next he'll be hiring women and children." Dominic kept his eyes on his food, chewing mechanically. He'd heard worse. The mockery wasn't new, and he'd learned that responding only made it worse. Better to keep his head down and let his work speak for itself. The afternoon was even harder than the morning. The temperature climbed past 100 degrees, and the desert sun beat down without mercy. Dominic's shirt was soaked through, and his leg trembled with exhaustion, but he refused to stop. He carried supplies, helped position rails, and even assisted with driving spikes when his hands were steady enough. By the time Morrison called an end to the workday, Dominic could barely stand. The foreman approached him as the crew dispersed. "You got grit, O'Brien, I'll give you that. But I don't know if grit's enough. You were slower than the others, and in this business, time is money." "I'll get faster," Dominic said, his voice hoarse. "Give me a week. I'll prove I'm worth keeping." Morrison studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "1 week. But you're on probation, and if you can't keep up, you're done. Wages are $1.50 a day, paid at the end of the week." "Thank you," Dominic said, relief washing over him despite his exhaustion. He limped back to town as the sun set, each step an exercise in willpower. When he finally reached the saloon, he was so tired he could barely climb the stairs to his room. He collapsed onto the bed fully clothed and fell into a dreamless sleep. The next few days followed the same grueling pattern. Dominic worked until his body was ready to give out, endured the mockery of the other workers, and returned to his room each night too exhausted to do anything but sleep. On the 4th day, as he was hauling a crate of supplies across the camp, his leg gave out completely. He fell hard, the crate spilling its contents across the ground. Laughter erupted from the nearby workers. "There he goes again," one man called out. "Can't even walk without falling on his face." "Maybe you should crawl, Gimpy," another added. "Might be faster." Dominic's face burned with humiliation as he pushed himself up and began gathering the scattered supplies. His hands shook with a mixture of exhaustion and anger, but he forced himself to keep moving. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him quit. "That's enough," a woman's voice cut through the laughter, sharp and clear. Dominic looked up to see a woman striding toward him from the direction of town. She was tall and slender, with dark hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat. Her face was sun-browned and her clothes were practical, a simple cotton dress covered by a leather apron. She carried a large basket over one arm. The workers fell silent as she approached. She set her basket down and knelt beside Dominic, helping him gather the spilled supplies. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice quieter now but still firm. "I'm fine," Dominic muttered, not meeting her eyes. "Just clumsy." "There's nothing clumsy about working yourself to exhaustion in this heat," she said. She turned to look at the men who had been laughing. "You all should be ashamed of yourselves. A man's worth isn't in his walk. It's in his character and his willingness to work hard, and from what I've seen, this man has more of both than most of you combined." One of the workers, a lanky fellow with a face full of freckles, opened his mouth to respond, but the woman's glare silenced him. She turned back to Dominic and helped him to his feet. "My name is Hannah Porter. I run the general store in town. I've been bringing supplies out to the camp a few times a week." "Dominic O'Brien," he said, finally meeting her gaze. Her eyes were a warm brown, and there was a kindness in them that made his chest tighten. "Thank you for the help, but you didn't need to do that." "Maybe not, but someone had to say something," Hannah replied. "Those men have no right to treat you that way." "They're just having fun," Dominic said, though the words tasted bitter. "I'm used to it." "That doesn't make it right," Hannah said. She picked up her basket and began pulling out wrapped sandwiches and jars of water. "I bring food for the crew at midday. Make sure you get something to eat and drink. You look like you're about to collapse." Dominic wanted to argue, but his stomach growled loudly, and Hannah smiled. "Go on. No sense being proud when you're hungry." He took a sandwich and a jar of water, murmuring his thanks. Hannah distributed the rest of the food to the other workers, many of whom had the decency to look ashamed after her earlier rebuke. When she finished, she returned to Dominic. "How long have you been working here?" she asked. "This is my 4th day," Dominic said. "I'm on probation. Morrison's giving me a week to prove I can keep up." Hannah's expression softened. "That leg of yours is causing you trouble, isn't it?" Dominic stiffened. "I can do the work." "I'm not saying you can't," Hannah said gently. "I'm just saying you're pushing yourself too hard. Have you seen a doctor about it?" "Saw one in San Bernardino when it happened," Dominic said. "He did what he could. Nothing more to be done." Hannah was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Well, make sure you're drinking enough water. The heat out here can kill a man faster than any injury. And if you need anything from the store, come by. I'll make sure you're taken care of." Before Dominic could respond, Morrison called for the crew to get back to work. Hannah picked up her empty basket and headed back toward town. Dominic watched her go, something warm and unfamiliar stirring in his chest. No one had stood up for him like that since the injury. Most people either pitied him or mocked him, but Hannah had done neither. She'd simply treated him like a man who deserved respect, and that meant more to him than she could possibly know. That evening, after work, Dominic made his way to the general store. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, and the oppressive heat of the day was finally beginning to ease. The store was a sturdy building with a false front and a wide porch. A sign above the door read, "Porter's General Store," in faded letters. Inside, the store was surprisingly well stocked for such a small town. Shelves lined the walls, filled with everything from canned goods to tools to bolts of fabric. Hannah stood behind the counter, writing in a ledger. She looked up when Dominic entered, and a smile crossed her face. "Mr. O'Brien," she said, "I was hoping you'd stop by." "Just Dominic, please," he said. "I wanted to thank you again for what you did today. You didn't have to speak up like that." "Yes, I did," Hannah said, setting down her pen. "I can't stand by and watch people be cruel. My father taught me that. He used to say that kindness costs nothing but means everything." "Your father sounds like a good man," Dominic said. Hannah's smile faded slightly. "He was. He passed away 2 years ago, left me the store in enough debt to sink a ship. I've been working to pay it off ever since." "I'm sorry," Dominic said. "That must be hard." "It is, but I manage," Hannah said. She studied him for a moment. "How are you holding up? You looked exhausted when I saw you earlier." "I've been better," Dominic admitted, "but I've been worse too. I just need to make it through the week so Morrison will keep me on." Hannah leaned against the counter, her expression thoughtful. "Why is this job so important to you? There must be other work you could do, something that wouldn't be so hard on your leg." Dominic was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Finally, he said, "Because I need to prove to myself that I'm still worth something. Before I got shot, I was a ranch hand, a good one. I could do anything the other cowboys could do, and I took pride in that. Now, every time I walk, I'm reminded that I'm not who I used to be. The other men at my last ranch made sure I knew it too. They called me names, laughed at me, treated me like I was useless. I left because I couldn't take it anymore. I came here to start over, to prove that I'm still a man who can work hard and earn his keep." Hannah's eyes were soft with understanding. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone, Dominic. Your worth as a man has nothing to do with whether you can walk straight or work as fast as someone else. It's about who you are inside, about your heart and your character." "That's easy to say," Dominic replied, "but the world doesn't see it that way. People judge you by what you can do, not by who you are." "Some people do," Hannah agreed. "But not everyone, and the people whose opinions matter are the ones who see beyond the surface." She paused, then added, "I see a man who refuses to give up, who works himself to exhaustion to prove his worth. That tells me more about your character than your limp ever could." Dominic felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That means more than you know." Hannah smiled again. "Now, what can I get for you? I assume you didn't just come here to chat." Dominic glanced around the store. "I could use some liniment for my leg if you have any, and maybe some jerky for lunch tomorrow." "I have both," Hannah said. She moved around the store, gathering the items. As she worked, she asked, "Where are you staying?" "At the saloon. Margaret's renting me a room." "Margaret's a good woman, even if she's a bit gruff," Hannah said. She wrapped the liniment and jerky in brown paper and tied them with string. "That'll be 50 cents. Dominic paid and took the package. "Thank you, Hannah." "You're welcome," she said. "And Dominic? Don't be a stranger. If you need anything or if you just want someone to talk to, my door is always open." Dominic left the store feeling lighter than he had in months. There was something about Hannah that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't felt since before the injury. She didn't look at him with pity or scorn. She looked at him like he was a man worth knowing, and that was a gift he hadn't expected to find in this dusty desert town. Over the next few days, Dominic fell into a routine. He worked at the railroad camp from dawn until dusk, pushing his body to its limits. The mockery from the other workers continued, but it bothered him less after Hannah's words. At the end of each day, he would stop by the general store to buy supplies or simply to talk with Hannah. She had a way of making him feel at ease, and their conversations ranged from the mundane to the meaningful. He learned that Hannah was 24 years old, just 2 years younger than him. She'd grown up in Mojave, the daughter of the town's general store owner. Her mother had died when she was young, and she had helped her father run the store from the time she was old enough to count change. When her father passed away, Hannah had inherited not just the store, but also his debts to various suppliers. She'd been working tirelessly to pay them off, determined to keep her father's legacy alive. "Why didn't you sell the store?" Dominic asked one evening as they sat on the porch of the general store, watching the sun set over the desert. "I thought about it," Hannah admitted. "But this store was my father's dream. He built it from nothing, and I couldn't bear to let it go. Besides, what would I do? Where would I go? This town is my home." "It's a hard life, running a business on your own," Dominic said. "It is," Hannah agreed. "But it's my life, and I've made my peace with it. What about you? Do you have family somewhere?" Dominic shook his head. "My parents died when I was young. I was raised in an orphanage in Sacramento until I was old enough to work. I've been on my own ever since." Hannah reached over and placed her hand on his. The touch was gentle, almost tentative, but it sent a jolt of warmth through Dominic's entire body. "Then we're both orphans in our own way," she said softly. "Maybe that's why I feel like I can talk to you. You understand what it's like to be alone." Dominic looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something other than shame and exhaustion. He felt hope. "I don't feel alone when I'm with you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Hannah's cheeks flushed and she smiled. "I don't feel alone either." They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. Dominic knew he was falling for Hannah, and the realization both thrilled and terrified him. He was a crippled cowboy with no prospects and nothing to offer. She was a beautiful, intelligent woman who deserved so much more than he could give. But when she looked at him, he didn't see pity or scorn. He saw something that looked like affection, maybe even love, and it made him want to be better, to be worthy of her. At the end of the week, Morrison called Dominic over after work. The foreman's expression was unreadable as he pulled out a small leather pouch. "You did it, O'Brien. You kept up with the crew, and you didn't complain. I've decided to keep you on." Relief flooded through Dominic. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. You won't regret it." "See that I don't," Morrison said, handing him the pouch. "That's your wages for the week. You'll be paid every Saturday from now on." Dominic took the money and headed back to town, his heart lighter than it had been in months. He stopped at the general store and found Hannah closing up for the evening. "I got the job," he said, unable to keep the smile off his face. Hannah's face lit up. "That's wonderful, Dominic. I knew you could do it." "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "Your words that day, they gave me the strength to keep going." Hannah stepped closer to him, her eyes shining. "You had that strength all along. I just reminded you of it." Dominic wanted to kiss her. He wanted to pull her into his arms and tell her that she was the most amazing woman he'd ever met, but he held back, uncertain if she felt the same way. Instead, he said, "Would you let me take you to dinner? As a thank you?" Hannah's smile widened. "I'd like that very much." They went to the small restaurant attached to the saloon, a cramped room with a handful of tables and a menu that consisted of whatever the cook felt like making that day. The food was simple but hearty, and the conversation flowed easily. They talked about their hopes and dreams, their fears and regrets. Dominic told Hannah about his life as a cowboy, about the ranches he'd worked and the places he'd seen. Hannah told him about growing up in Mojave, about the struggles of running the store and the loneliness of being the only woman her age in town. Most of the young people leave as soon as they're able, Hannah said. They go to Los Angeles or San Francisco looking for opportunity. I don't blame them. There's not much here. There's you, Dominic said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Hannah blushed and looked down at her plate. That's very kind of you to say. It's not kindness. It's the truth, Dominic said. He reached across the table and took her hand. Hannah, I know I don't have much to offer. I'm just a cowboy with a limp and a few dollars to my name. But being around you makes me want to be more. You make me feel like I'm worth something, like I have value beyond what I can do with my hands or my legs. I don't know if you feel the same way, but I needed you to know. Hannah's eyes glistened with tears. I do feel the same way, Dominic. From the first moment I saw you at the camp, working so hard despite everything, I knew you were someone special. You have more strength and courage than any man I've ever met, and your limp doesn't diminish that. It's part of who you are, and I think you're perfect just the way you are. Dominic felt like his heart might burst. He stood up and moved to her side of the table, pulling her to her feet. Can I kiss you? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Yes, Hannah whispered. He kissed her gently, tenderly, pouring all of his gratitude and affection into that single moment. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. Over the next few months, Dominic and Hannah's relationship deepened. Dominic continued working at the railroad camp, and though the work was still hard and his legs still ached, the mockery from the other workers gradually faded. Some of the men even began to respect him, acknowledging that he worked as hard as anyone, despite his disability. Morrison promoted him to a supervisory role, overseeing supply distribution, which was easier on his leg and paid better. Hannah's store began to thrive as well. With the railroad bringing more workers and travelers to Mojave, business picked up considerably. She was able to pay off her father's debts and even expand her inventory. Dominic helped her whenever he could, hauling heavy crates and organizing shelves after his shifts at the camp. They spent every free moment together, walking through the desert in the cool evenings, sharing meals and talking about the future. Dominic had never felt happier or more content. For the first time in his life, he had something worth fighting for, something worth building toward. One evening in late autumn, as they sat on the porch of the general store watching the sunset, Dominic turned to Hannah and said, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Hannah looked at him, her expression curious. Of course. What is it? Do you think we have a future together? Dominic asked. I know I'm not the man most women would choose. I'm crippled, I don't have much money, and my prospects are limited. But I love you, Hannah. I love you more than I thought I could love anyone. And if there's even a chance that you could see yourself spending your life with me, I want to know. Hannah's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Dominic O'Brien, you are exactly the man I would choose. Your limp doesn't matter to me. Your money doesn't matter to me. What matters is your heart, your kindness, and the way you make me feel when I'm with you. I love you too. And yes, I absolutely see a future with you. I can't imagine my life without you now. Dominic felt a surge of joy so intense it almost hurt. He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple silver ring. I've been saving my wages for this. It's not much, but I wanted to give you something to show you how serious I am. Hannah Porter, will you marry me? Hannah gasped, tears streaming down her face. Yes, she said, her voice breaking. Yes, yes, 1,000 times, yes. Dominic slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, feeling like the luckiest man in the world. They held each other as the last light faded from the sky, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. They were married in the spring of 1880, in a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of town. The preacher, a kind old man named Reverend Walsh, officiated, and a handful of townspeople attended. Even Morrison came, shaking Dominic's hand and wishing him well. It was a modest affair, but it was perfect. After the wedding, Dominic moved into the small house behind the general store where Hannah had been living. It was a cozy space with 2 rooms and a kitchen, and Hannah had made it warm and inviting with curtains and quilts and little touches that made it feel like home. Dominic had never had a real home before, and the feeling of belonging was almost overwhelming. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Dominic continued working at the railroad, which was making steady progress across the desert. Hannah ran the store, and together they began to build a life. They talked about expanding the house, maybe even starting a family someday. The future stretched out before them, full of possibility and promise. But the past has a way of catching up with people, and one day in early summer, Dominic's past came riding into Mojave on a dust-covered horse. Dominic was at the store, helping Hannah unload a shipment of canned goods, when a man walked through the door. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and cold blue eyes. Dominic recognized him immediately, and his blood ran cold. "Well, well," the man said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "If it isn't Gimpy O'Brien. I heard you were hiding out here in the middle of nowhere." "What do you want, Carson?" Dominic asked, his voice tight. Hannah looked between them, her expression concerned. "Dominic, who is this?" "This is Jake Carson," Dominic said. "He worked at the same ranch I did, back before the injury." Carson's smile widened. "That's right. I was there the night you got shot. In fact, I was there when you were begging for your life, crying like a little baby." Dominic's hands clenched into fists. "That's not how it happened, and you know it." "Does she know you're a coward?" Carson said, nodding toward Hannah. "Does she know you ran away from the rustlers instead of standing and fighting?" "I was outnumbered 5-1, Dominic said, his voice shaking with anger. "I tried to get help, and that's when they shot me." "That's one version of the story," Carson said with a shrug. "The way I remember it, you turned tail and ran the moment things got dangerous. You left the rest of us to deal with the rustlers while you saved your own skin." "That's a lie," Dominic said, stepping toward Carson. Hannah moved between them, placing a hand on Dominic's chest. "That's enough. Mr. Carson, I think you should leave." Carson laughed. "You've got yourself a feisty one, O'Brien. Does she know what she's getting into, marrying a crippled coward?" "Get out," Hannah said, her voice like steel. "Get out of my store right now, or I'll have the marshal throw you out." Carson held up his hands in mock surrender. All right, I'm going. Just wanted to say hello to an old friend." He tipped his hat to Hannah and sauntered out of the store. Dominic stood frozen, his entire body trembling with anger and shame. Hannah turned to him, her face full of concern. "Dominic, what was that about?" "It's nothing," Dominic said, his voice hollow. "He's just trying to cause trouble." "It didn't sound like nothing," Hannah said gently. "What happened that night?" Dominic turned away from her, unable to meet her eyes. "We were moving cattle when a group of rustlers attacked. There were 5 of them and only 3 of us. I tried to ride for help, but one of them shot me before I could get away. I fell off my horse and crawled into the brush. I laid there for hours, bleeding and in pain, until the ranch hands found me the next morning. The other 2 men drove off the rustlers, and they were treated like heroes. I was treated like a failure." "But you were trying to get help," Hannah said. "That's not cowardice, that's smart thinking." "Maybe," Dominic said, "but it didn't matter. Once the other cowboys found out I'd been shot running away. They decided I was a coward. Carson was one of the worst. He never let me forget it. And now he's here, dredging it all up again." Hannah wrapped her arms around him from behind, pressing her cheek against his back. "You're not a coward, Dominic. You never were. Carson is a cruel, small-minded man who gets his pleasure from hurting others. Don't let him make you doubt yourself." "I'm trying," Dominic said, his voice breaking. "But it's hard. I've spent so long trying to prove I'm not what they said I was, and now he's here, bringing it all back." "Then prove it to yourself, not to him," Hannah said. "You know who you are. I know who you are. That's all that matters." Dominic turned and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God every day that you're in my life." "You didn't have to do anything," Hannah whispered. "You just had to be you." Over the next few days, Carson's presence in Mojave became impossible to ignore. He spent most of his time at the saloon, drinking and telling anyone who would listen about Dominic's supposed cowardice. The story grew more exaggerated with each telling. By the end of the week, half the town believed Dominic had abandoned his fellow cowboys and run away crying. The mockery started up again at the railroad camp. Men who had come to respect Dominic now looked at him with suspicion and scorn. His limp, which had become just another part of who he was, became a symbol of his weakness in their eyes. Morrison pulled him aside one afternoon and asked if there was any truth to Carson's stories. "I tried to get help," Dominic said, his voice tight with frustration. "I was shot before I could reach town. That's the truth." Morrison studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I believe you, O'Brien, but you need to understand that this is affecting morale. Some of the men are saying they don't want to work alongside a coward. I can't have that kind of division in the crew." "What are you saying?" Dominic asked, though he already knew the answer. "I'm saying you need to deal with this," Morrison said. "Either confront Carson and set the record straight, or find work elsewhere. I can't have this hanging over the camp." Dominic felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "I understand." That evening, he sat with Hannah in their small house, staring into the fire. "I don't know what to do," he said. "If I confront Carson, it'll just turn into a fight, and I'm in no condition to fight him. But if I don't, I'll lose my job and my reputation." Hannah was quiet for a moment, then said, "What if you told the truth? Not just to Carson, but to everyone. What if you stood up in front of the whole town and told your side of the story?" "Who would believe me?" Dominic asked. "Carson's story is more exciting. People love a scandal." "Some people might not believe you," Hannah agreed, "but some will. And those are the people whose opinions matter. Besides, you can't let Carson control the narrative. You have to fight back. Not with your fists, but with the truth." Dominic looked at his wife, her face illuminated by the firelight, and felt a surge of love and admiration. She was right. He couldn't let Carson's lies go unchallenged. He had to stand up for himself, even if it meant facing the judgment of the entire town. The next Sunday, Dominic asked Reverend Walsh if he could address the congregation after the service. The preacher, who had heard the rumors and didn't believe them, agreed. When the service ended, Dominic stood at the front of the church, his heart pounding in his chest. Hannah sat in the front pew, giving him an encouraging smile. "I know most of you have heard the stories Jake Carson has been spreading about me," Dominic began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "He's been saying I'm a coward, that I abandoned my fellow cowboys and ran away during a rustler attack. I'm here to tell you the truth." He went on to describe what had happened that night, leaving nothing out. He talked about the fear he'd felt, the decision to ride for help, and the bullet that had shattered his leg. He described the hours he'd spent lying in the brush, bleeding and in pain, wondering if he was going to die. He talked about the shame he'd felt when the other cowboys labeled him a coward and the determination that had driven him to start over in Mojave. "I'm not a hero," Dominic said, his voice breaking slightly, "but I'm not a coward either. I did what I thought was right in that moment, and I've paid the price for it every day since. My leg is a constant reminder of that night, but it doesn't define who I am. I'm a man who works hard, who loves his wife, and who tries to do right by the people around him. If that's not enough for some of you, then so be it. But I won't stand by and let someone else tell my story for me." The church was silent when he finished. Dominic looked out at the congregation, trying to gauge their reactions. Some people looked sympathetic, others skeptical. But then, to his surprise, Morrison stood up. "I've worked with Dominic O'Brien for months now," the foreman said. "He's one of the hardest workers I've ever had on my crew. He doesn't complain, he doesn't quit, and he earns his pay every single day. I don't know what happened that night on the ranch, but I know the man I've seen here in Mojave, and that man is no coward." Another man stood up, one of the workers from the railroad camp. "I've seen him carry supplies in the desert heat when his leg was so swollen he could barely walk. He never asked for special treatment, never made excuses. That takes guts." One by one, people began to stand and speak in Dominic's defense. Not everyone believed him, and some remained seated, but enough people stood that Dominic felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Hannah was crying, her face radiant with pride. After the service, people came up to shake Dominic's hand and offer their support. Carson wasn't in attendance, but word would get back to him. Dominic knew the fight wasn't over, but at least now he had people on his side. 2 days later, Carson confronted Dominic outside the general store. It was late afternoon, and the street was relatively empty. Carson was drunk, his eyes bleary and his movements unsteady. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Carson slurred, "getting all those people to feel sorry for you. But I know the truth. You're a coward and a cripple, and nothing you say will change that. Go home, Carson, Dominic said calmly. Sleep it off. Or what? Carson said, stepping closer. You going to fight me, Gimpy? We both know how that would turn out. I don't want to fight you, Dominic said. I just want you to leave me and my wife alone. Carson's face twisted with rage. Your wife? That stuck-up shopkeeper who thinks she's better than everyone else. Maybe I should pay her a visit, teach her some manners. Something snapped inside Dominic. He grabbed Carson by the front of his shirt and shoved him back against the wall of the store. You stay away from her, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You even look at her wrong and I'll make you regret it. Carson laughed, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. There it is. There's the coward showing his true colors. I'm not a coward, Dominic said, his grip tightening, but I'm a man who protects what's his. You want to spread lies about me, fine, but you threaten my wife, and we're going to have a problem. Hannah's voice cut through the tension. Dominic, let him go. Dominic turned to see his wife standing in the doorway of the store, her face pale but determined. He released Carson and stepped back. Carson straightened his shirt, glaring at Dominic. This isn't over, Carson said. Yes, it is, Hannah said firmly. You're not welcome in my store, Mr. Carson, and if you continue to harass my husband, I'll file a complaint with the marshal. Now leave. Carson looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Hannah's expression made him think better of it. He spat on the ground and stalked off down the street. Dominic watched him go, his heart still racing. Are you all right? Hannah asked, touching his arm. I'm fine, Dominic said. I'm sorry you had to see that. Don't apologize, Hannah said. You were protecting me. There's nothing to be sorry for. She paused, then added, but we need to be careful. Carson's dangerous when he's drunk. I know, Dominic said. I'll talk to the marshal tomorrow, make sure he knows what's going on. The marshal, a grizzled old lawman named Tom Briggs, took Dominic's complaint seriously. He promised to keep an eye on Carson and warned him to stay away from the O'Briens. For a few days, things were quiet. Carson stayed at the saloon, drinking himself into oblivion, and Dominic began to hope that the worst was over. But then, one night in early July, Dominic woke to the smell of smoke. He bolted upright, his heart pounding, and saw orange light flickering through the window. He shook Hannah awake. Fire, he said. The store's on fire. They scrambled out of bed and ran outside. The front of the general store was engulfed in flames, the heat intense even from a distance. Dominic could see Carson standing across the street, watching the fire with a satisfied smile on his face. Get help, Dominic shouted to Hannah. Wake the neighbors! Hannah ran to the nearest house, pounding on the door. Dominic limped toward the store, desperate to save what he could. But the fire was spreading too fast, and he knew it was hopeless. The townsfolk began to emerge from their homes, forming a bucket brigade from the well. They fought the fire for hours, but by the time the flames were finally extinguished, the store was nothing but a charred ruin. Hannah stood in front of the wreckage, tears streaming down her face. Dominic put his arm around her, his own heart breaking. Everything they'd worked for, everything her father had built, was gone. Marshal Briggs arrested Carson that night. Several witnesses had seen him near the store before the fire started, and a can of kerosene was found in his possession. He was charged with arson and locked in the town's small jail to await trial. In the days that followed, the community rallied around Dominic and Hannah. People brought food, offered places to stay, and pledged to help rebuild the store. Morrison gave Dominic a raise and advanced him several weeks' pay. The railroad company, which relied on the general store for supplies, donated lumber and materials for the reconstruction. I can't believe how kind everyone's being, Hannah said one evening as they sat in the small room above the saloon where they were temporarily staying. I thought we'd lost everything. We did lose a lot, Dominic said, but we still have each other, and we have a community that cares about us. That's worth more than any building. Hannah leaned against him, exhausted, but grateful. You're right. We'll rebuild. It won't be easy, but we'll do it together. The trial was held 2 weeks later. Carson was found guilty of arson and sentenced to 10 years in prison. As he was led away, he glared at Dominic with pure hatred, but Dominic felt no satisfaction in the man's downfall. All he felt was relief that the nightmare was finally over. Rebuilding the store took months. Dominic worked on it every evening after his shift at the railroad, and Hannah spent her days organizing supplies and planning the layout. The new store was bigger and sturdier than the old one, with a proper stockroom and living quarters above it. By the time it was finished in late October, it was the finest building in Mojave. The grand reopening was a celebration for the entire town. People came from miles around to see the new store and congratulate Dominic and Hannah. As they stood together on the porch, cutting the ribbon, Dominic looked at his wife and felt a surge of gratitude. She had stood by him through everything, never doubting him, never wavering in her support. He didn't know what he'd done to deserve her, but he was determined to spend the rest of his life making her happy. Life returned to normal after that, or as normal as life in a desert town could be. The railroad was completed in early 1881, and Mojave began to grow. More people moved to town, businesses opened, and the future looked bright. Dominic continued working for the railroad, eventually becoming a full-time supervisor. His limp never went away, but it no longer defined him. He was known in Mojave as a hard worker, a devoted husband, and a man of integrity. In the spring of 1882, Hannah discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and a little bit of fear. They had talked about starting a family, but now that it was actually happening, the reality was overwhelming. "What if I'm not a good father?" Dominic asked one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting on Hannah's growing belly. "You'll be a wonderful father," Hannah said firmly. "You're kind, patient, and strong. Our child will be lucky to have you." "I just want to give them a better life than I had," Dominic said. "I want them to grow up knowing they're loved and valued, no matter what." "They will," Hannah assured him. "We'll make sure of it." Their son was born in December of 1882, a healthy baby boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's brown eyes. They named him Daniel, after Hannah's father. Holding his son for the first time, Dominic felt a love so fierce it almost frightened him. He looked at Hannah, exhausted but glowing with happiness, and knew that this was what his life had been leading to. All the pain, all the struggle, all the shame had brought him to this moment. "He's perfect," Dominic whispered, tears streaming down his face. "He is," Hannah agreed, "just like his father." As Daniel grew, Dominic made sure to teach him the lessons he'd learned. He taught him that a man's worth wasn't measured by his physical abilities, but by his character and his heart. He taught him to be kind, to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, and to never judge someone based on their appearance or circumstances. And most importantly, he taught him that love was the most powerful force in the world, capable of healing even the deepest wounds. In 1885, their daughter Helen was born, a spirited little girl who had her mother's determination and her father's stubbornness. The O'Brien family was complete, and their little house behind the general store was filled with laughter and love. The years passed and Mojave continued to grow and prosper. The railroad brought new opportunities, and the town became an important stop on the route between Los Angeles and Points East. The general store thrived under Hannah's management, becoming one of the most successful businesses in town. Dominic eventually retired from the railroad and began working full-time at the store, helping Hannah manage the growing inventory and expanding customer base. One evening in the summer of 1890, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard, Hannah turned to Dominic and said, "Do you ever think about that first day we met? When you were at the railroad camp and I told those men off?" Dominic smiled. "I think about it all the time. That was the day my life changed." "Mine too," Hannah said. She took his hand, their fingers intertwining. "I'm so glad I spoke up that day. I'm so glad I had the courage to tell you what I saw in you." "A man's worth isn't in his walk," Dominic said softly, repeating the words she'd said all those years ago. "It's in his character and his willingness to work hard." "And you have more of both than anyone I've ever known," Hannah said, leaning her head on his shoulder. Dominic wrapped his arm around her, watching the sun set over the desert. His legs still ached on cold days, and his limp was still there, a permanent reminder of the night that had changed his life. But it no longer filled him with shame. Instead, it reminded him of how far he'd come, of the strength he'd found within himself, and of the incredible woman who had helped him see his own worth. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Daniel and Helen ran up to the porch, their faces flushed with play. Daniel, now 7 years old, climbed onto Dominic's lap while Helen, 5, settled against Hannah's side. "Papa, tell us the story about how you and Mama met," Daniel said, as he did almost every night. Dominic exchanged a glance with Hannah, both of them smiling. "Well," he began, "it all started on a very hot day in the desert when I was working harder than I'd ever worked in my life, and a beautiful woman came along and reminded me that I was more than I thought I was." "And she fell in love with you," Helen said, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "She did," Dominic said, kissing the top of his daughter's head, "and I fell in love with her, and we built a life together. And now we have you two, which makes us the luckiest people in the world." "Tell us about the fire," Daniel said excitedly, "and the bad man who went to jail." "That's a story for another night," Hannah said gently. "It's time for bed." The children groaned but didn't argue. They said their good nights and headed inside, their footsteps echoing through the house. Dominic and Hannah remained on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms. "Thank you," Dominic said quietly. "For what?" Hannah asked. "For seeing me when no one else did. For believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. For loving me despite everything." Hannah pulled back slightly so she could look into his eyes. "Dominic O'Brien, there is no despite. I love you not in spite of who you are, but because of who you are. Every part of you, including the parts you thought were weaknesses, they made you strong. They made you the man I fell in love with." Dominic kissed her, a long, tender kiss that held all the love and gratitude he felt. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "Come on," Hannah said, standing and pulling him to his feet. "Let's go tuck the children in together." They walked into the house, Dominic's limp as pronounced as ever, but neither of them noticed. It was just part of who he was, no more significant than the color of his eyes or the sound of his voice. Inside, their children were already in their beds, waiting for their parents to say goodnight. As Dominic stood in the doorway of his children's room, watching Hannah sing them a lullaby, he felt a sense of peace and contentment that he'd never thought possible. His journey had been long and painful, filled with mockery and shame and self-doubt, but it had led him here, to this moment, to this family, to this life. He thought about the young man he'd been when he first rode into Mojave, broken and desperate and convinced he was worthless. He thought about Hannah's words that day at the railroad camp, the words that had changed everything. A man's worth isn't in his walk. Those words had given him hope when he had none, had shown him a different way of seeing himself. And now, more than a decade later, those words had proven true in ways he never could have imagined. His worth wasn't in his ability to walk without a limp or work faster than the other men. It was in the love he had for his wife and children, in the business they had built together, in the life they had created in this small desert town. It was in the way he'd faced his fears and overcome them, not by becoming someone different, but by accepting who he was and refusing to let others define him. As the years continued to pass, the O'Brien family became a cornerstone of the Mojave community. The general store expanded twice more, eventually taking up an entire block. Daniel grew into a thoughtful young man who wanted to become a teacher, while Helen showed an aptitude for business that reminded everyone of her mother. Dominic and Hannah grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1905, the town threw them a celebration. People came from all over to honor the couple who had contributed so much to Mojave's growth and prosperity. There were speeches and toasts, music and dancing. But the moment Dominic treasured most was when he and Hannah slipped away from the crowd and walked out into the desert, just the two of them under the stars. "Do you have any regrets?" Hannah asked, her hair now streaked with silver, but her eyes still as bright as the day they'd met. "Not a single one," Dominic said. "Well, maybe one." "What's that?" "I regret that I didn't meet you sooner," Dominic said with a smile. "Think of all the years we could have had together." Hannah laughed, the sound as beautiful as it had been 25 years ago. "We've had plenty of years, and God willing, we'll have many more." "I hope so," Dominic said. He pulled her close, swaying gently as if they were still at the party. "I love you, Hannah, more than words can say." "I love you too," Hannah whispered, my brave, wonderful husband, the man who proved that strength comes in many forms. They stood there in the desert, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life on a foundation of love and mutual respect. Dominic's limp was still there, a permanent part of him, but it had long since ceased to matter. He was a husband, a father, a businessman, and a respected member of the community. He was everything he'd been afraid he'd never be, and it was all because one woman had seen past his disability and recognized the man beneath. As they walked back to the celebration, hand in hand, Dominic thought about the journey that had brought him here. It had been long and difficult, filled with pain and humiliation, and moments where he'd wanted to give up. But it had also been filled with love and triumph, and the discovery that true worth came from within, not from the approval of others. He glanced at Hannah, her face illuminated by the lights of the town, and felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it made his chest ache. She had been his salvation, his champion, his partner in every sense of the word. She had looked at a limping cowboy and seen a man worth loving, and in doing so, she had given him the greatest gift imaginable, the ability to see himself through her eyes. The years continued to unfold, bringing both joy and sorrow as all lives do. Daniel became a teacher as he'd dreamed, opening a school in Mojave that served children from all over the region. Helen married a railroad engineer and helped expand the family business even further. Dominic and Hannah became grandparents, delighting in the new generation that carried forward their legacy. Through it all, they remained devoted to each other, their love as strong in their twilight years as it had been in their youth. When Dominic's health began to fail in his 70s, Hannah cared for him with the same tenderness she'd shown from the beginning. And when he finally passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1915, surrounded by his family, his last words were, "Thank you for seeing me." Hannah lived for several more years, running the store with Helen's help and telling anyone who would listen about her remarkable husband. She spoke of his courage, his determination, and his unwavering love. She told the story of how they'd met, how he'd worked himself to exhaustion to prove his worth, and how she'd fallen in love with a man who refused to let his disability define him. When Hannah passed away in 1920, the entire town mourned. She was laid to rest beside Dominic in the Mojave cemetery, their headstones side by side just as they'd spent their lives. On Hannah's stone, beneath her name and dates, her children had inscribed the words she'd spoken all those years ago at the railroad camp. "A man's worth isn't in his walk." Those words became a legend in Mojave, passed down through generations as a reminder that true value comes not from physical perfection, but from the content of one's character. The O'Brien family continued to thrive, and the general store remained a fixture of the town for decades to come. And whenever someone told the story of Dominic and Hannah O'Brien, they spoke of a love that had overcome prejudice and mockery, a love built on respect and understanding, a love that had proven that the human spirit could triumph over any obstacle. In the end, Dominic O'Brien's limp had not defined him. It had tested him, challenged him, and forced him to discover depths of strength he hadn't known he possessed. But it was Hannah's love and faith in him that had truly transformed his life, showing him that he was so much more than his physical limitations. Together, they had built something beautiful and lasting, a legacy of love and resilience that would endure long after they were gone. Their story became part of Mojave's history, a testament to the power of seeing beyond the surface and recognizing the true worth of another human being. And for generations to come, when people in that small desert town faced their own challenges and doubts, they remembered the cowboy with a limp and the woman who loved him, and they found the courage to believe in themselves, just as Dominic and Hannah had believed in each other all those years ago.